The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata, and that is the most important part, that we realize the true mind, our very own true mind. It is the mind to which the Buddha awakened, and it is universal. It is called by different names in different religions, but it is universal. It is what underlies all of us, everything. And in realizing it, in other words, in opening to the experience of being in the presence, and there's nobody outside being in the presence of something else, but opening to awareness of that deep, pure flow within is liberating. Of course, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes commitment, it takes faith, because it's a long haul normally. And at a certain point, that no longer matters, because we are so involved in the process and have experienced such positive results, which aren't necessarily the first thing we've experienced in our practice. But once we get to a certain point in that practice where we recognize that there are these moments when we have insights, and that those insights inform our lives in many different ways, then we begin to really work in earnest on this long maturation, opening ever more to the more subtle aspects of this true mind, opening ever more to the subtle aspects of our attachments that prevent us from seeing it and living it. This is what our practice is about. And initially, it's an uphill haul. It's like you haven't been hiking for a while, or maybe ever, and you suddenly decide to climb a mountain. And so you start out with great enthusiasm, and fairly soon it begins to get a little tough and tiring. But if you persist, the strength comes, the faith comes. When I was in college, it was my freshman year, I think, at Miami University in Southern Ohio. It was 35 miles of rolling hills from Cincinnati. And my freshman roommate was someone who lived in Cincinnati. And so we got this brilliant idea at midnight one night, as teenagers will, to borrow bicycles and ride to Cincinnati. And then her mother would bring us back. They had a convertible, so they could put the bikes in the back and drive us back to Miami. Back in those days, there were only 1-speed bikes, nothing like 10-speed, nothing like clip-on shoes or anything like that. It was just very fundamental and basic. So we snuck out early in the morning and borrowed some bikes and set out. And pretty soon, I have to say, those rolling hills began to reach us. And we finally did make it after several hours to Cincinnati. And we were riding on the freeway within Cincinnati, and finally decided to bail and called her mom, and she picked us up, took us to her house, where we slept for 4 hours. And then she drove us back with the bikes to Miami. That was a push, but it was a good push. Neither of us were in any kind of shape. We hadn't ridden bikes. I hadn't ridden a bike since I was 8 years old. And that was not any constant bike. It was a bike that happened to be owned by friends of my parents, and I sort of learned how to ride it. It was an adult male bike. By putting my foot through under the bar and starting at the top of a hill in a street, actually. Back then, streets were not so full of cars as they are now. Many, many years later, I was in Zen practice at the Rochester Zen Center, and another friend of mine and I decided to go on canoe camping. We had a break from staff, which is what they were calling anybody who was in residence at Rochester were staff members. And so we drove up, we borrowed a car and drove up to Quebec province to La Vérendrye National Park, or I guess it would be called national, and rented a canoe and set out. It was the last 3 days that the park was going to be open. And it was fall, and it was cold. We would wake up with ice on the tent. And initially, we had to cross a lake. I had not canoed for a long time, and rarely canoed, actually. But as I crossed the lake, I could feel myself getting stronger. And then as we continued, because it was so thick, the forest, that we had to go we had to go by canoe. We could not go any other way. And so each day I got stronger. And it was a good thing because the final day, the wind came up against us. And in fact, we were going down this river that led into the lake. And the waves were so high that we didn't dare try to get into the canoe. It was cold enough, we would have had hypothermia. There was no way to be rescued. We had no contact with the outside world. And it was the last day of the park being open. We had to get that canoe back. So we pitched tent and hung out until early afternoon when the winds began to calm a little bit. And then we managed to get into the canoe and paddle down to the lake where we got the full brunt of the wind. It was quite an effort crossing that lake against the wind, but we managed. And thankfully, I had gotten strong enough in those 2 days prior to that it was not so easy, but I could do it. This is how Zen practice is. We begin inching along, and gradually we begin to get stronger, in a sense, in our practice. If we allow ourselves to be committed, if we allow ourselves to have the faith that what will happen as we continue our practice blindly, because it is blind for a long time, and it can seem against all sorts of headwinds. It can seem impossible sometimes. Then other times, there are little glimpses of presence. And we keep on going. And over the years, as we continue going, we go deeper. And we begin to see, little by little, some of the fruits of that practice. And hopefully we continue onward to the very end of our life and perhaps into the next life as well. Because as near as I can tell, there is no end to the uncovering of this amazingness that we are. No end to seeing the ever more subtle ways we are caught in blinding ourselves to it and in behaving in ways that are not in concert with what we really are. So on this 4th day of sesshin here at Mountain Gate at northern New Mexico in 2022, in December, it's the Rohatsu sesshin, honoring the Buddha's own first ever sesshin, the model for this sesshin and every sesshin from then till now and ongoing, I'm sure. And I'd like to share something that normally we have shared every single day, but I've held off because there were some more important things to share with you before this. And that is Hakuin's, Zen Master Hakuin's Rohatsu Exhortations to his monks. There's a little bit of translating needing to be done, even though it has been translated into English by Norman Waddell, who is a premier translator of Hakuin and has given permission for me to use this. It's not been published, and so his permission alone is sufficient. But there are some jewels within this, even though there's a vast difference in some areas in terms of the culture, because the Japanese culture is very different. Buddhism landed in Japan at a time when there was already a religion in Japan. It was a nature religion, really. Gods were embodied in trees, lakes, various different natural phenomena, and in the heavens as well. And so Buddhism incorporated those gods in practice. And this is not, it's not bad. Many religions claim exclusivity in spiritual practice and demand exclusive practice within that religion. But there is no exclusivity, really. The ability to go deep and experience whatever it is called, whether it's true nature, God, Allah, our spiritual roots, it doesn't matter what the name is, because it is nameless. We cannot name it. So let me share with you some. I won't share all of them, but I will share some of them. Hang on just a second. Okay, I will share some of these evening exhortations by the Zen master Hakuin, who, as you may know, lived in the 1700s in Japan and was highly regarded as the one who pulled Rinzai Zen out of the doldrums and resuscitated it to the point where it is still active today. He was dedicated, he was dynamic, and happened also to be a prolific artist and calligrapher. I don't know how he had the time both to write and to do calligraphies for countless students and other people. But he did, and his artistic talent is phenomenal. It ranges quite widely. If you ever have a chance to go to a Hakuin exhibition, do so. He was an amazing artist. And there was something rather interesting about some of his paintings. He had a deep awakening. Well, not his first. His first awakening was at the sound of the temple bell. But a later awakening, he had a dream in which he had felt something heavy in his mirror. And not in his mirror, in his sleeve, I should say. And I gave away the cut line here. And he looked inside his sleeve, and there was a mirror. And he held the mirror up. And in the mirror was the face of Kuan Yin. And somehow he recognized that he embodied Kuan Yin. We all embody Kuan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. We all are endowed with innate compassion as well as wisdom. It's not always so obvious. We may not even feel it. And other people also have more or less a degree of compassion revealed, but nonetheless, all of us are filled with compassion and wisdom. And so many of his paintings, his self-portraits, actually have his face as Kuan Yin. He had a rather distinctive face, by the way. So here, let me start with day 1. Hakuin's instructions to the monks for Rohatsu Sesshin, the first day. To practice jhana, in other words, meditation, you should sit yourself on a thick cushion, loosen your robe and belt, and assume the full lotus position. Now, right there, that's the ideal in terms of the Japanese traditional way, but it's certainly not essential. One can come to awakening in essentially any posture. As a matter of fact, there is a woman, was a woman, a Japanese woman, more or less contemporary, whose father had a sudden fear of death. He turned 60, which in Japan is considered to be a new beginning, because that's when your astrology comes full circle. And so all of a sudden he had this fear of death. And so he started doing zazen. And this is, I believe, in the 1940s. And after a year, he had a Kensho experience. His daughter, inspired by this dedication, started practicing zazen as well. But she only got to practice for something like 3 months because she was dying of TB. When one has TB, it's a major infection, in her case, in her lungs. It can infect various different parts of our body. I knew a doctor in Myanmar, in Burma, our pediatrician actually, who ended up breaking an ankle because it was filled with TB. And I know someone else whose wife ended up as a child getting TB in her hip. But most of the time, as far as I know it anyway, it lands in our lungs. And it's not prevalent too much anymore, although I gather it is so in Russian prisons, because there's a strain that is so virulent, it is resistant to the antibiotics that normally would cure it. And that is what happened in the United States. There were sanitariums, TB sanitariums, when I was a kid and even when I was in high school. But with the advances in antibiotics, the invention of antibiotics and the advances in them, the sanitariums were emptied because people were being cured. This was too early for that in Japan. And in Japan as well, families were ostracized when they got TB. And in fact, the young girls were considered unmarriageable because they might carry the plague to their husband's family. And so many of these young women actually went to the United States as mail order brides for Japanese men who were working in the sugar plantations in Hawaii. But at any rate, Yaiku Iwasaki, Yaiku Iwasaki was her name, and she was quite literally dying of TB. As it infects your lungs more completely, you begin coughing up blood, and there's a certain point when it's considered the end. So here she is, full of fever, coughing constantly, coughing up blood. I'm sure she couldn't really sit in the full lotus posture. And in fact, she probably couldn't sit up at all. She may well have been simply lying down, possibly against a number of pillows to prop her up a little bit, and coughing away. And yet, within that environment, within that bodily experience, she came to such profound awakening over the last 3 weeks of her life that each day she had a deeper Kensho experience. And Yasutani Roshi speaks of her it may have been, I believe that he was present at her death. And he said he had never seen a more peaceful dying. She simply let go. Profoundly awakened, profoundly aware of the true nature of life and death, having let go who she felt she needed to be, she simply let go. This is what we can reach as well, and hopefully we won't end up having to do it through vast illness. But one never knows how we are going to go. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's unexpected, sometimes we simply let go in the middle of our sleep, like one of my grandmothers did, and like my father did. But for others, it may be a stroke, a massive heart attack, like my mother, or some other form, cancer, like my brother. Whatever it is, the more deeply we can practice before that final moment happens, the more freely we will let go, the easier our dying will be. And as I said when I started this, we do not need to sit in full lotus in order to accomplish that. What we do need to do is focus our mind. And of course, initially, we won't be able to very easily, particularly not nowadays when there are so many distractions and so many technological distractions. We have iPhones, Androids, iPads, various different notebooks, televisions, all kinds of electronic gadgets to entertain us infinitely. And advertisers know that if they flash things rather rapidly, they'll get your attention. And even if you're sitting in a room, this is also known, you're sitting in a room and you're in conversation with somebody else and there's a television on in the room, you keep being sucked back to the television. And so we are trained, it's known also that it actually is changing our brains. We're trained to not be able to concentrate for more than a few seconds at a time. And this is an uphill battle in terms of our Zazen. Those of us who started Zazen before it became so ubiquitous have gotten an advantage. But nonetheless, regardless of where you start, so long as you persist, keep hauling your mind back to this extended out breath, even if it feels like you can't do it. Go into the feeling of can't do it and focus on that. Keep trying. Keep trying. And just as I got stronger and stronger with the paddle in that canoe camping experience in Canada, you too can get stronger and stronger in your ability to focus and concentrate. And you keep going in that direction. It makes an enormous difference. And it will make an enormous difference in the rest of your life as well, not just in your Zen practice. You'll find that as you get more able to concentrate in the Zendo, you'll be able to focus more fully, more completely for longer periods on what you have to do in your daily life. It makes a big difference. So let's continue. And I'm sorry I don't see so well, so this is going to be a little bit fuzzy. After straightening up your spine and settling into a comfortable position, you should begin counting your breaths. The breath exercise is foremost among all the countless samadhis. When the cinnabar field, and that's your tanden, your hara, when the cinnabar field below the navel fills to repletion with vital energy, start working on your koan. Cut life off at its roots. If you continue practicing like this, over the months and years, and are not remiss, your kensho is assured, as certain as reaching down and touching the earth at your feet. Strive hard, strive hard. Extending the out-breath naturally lets go of extraneous thinking if we persist. It takes time, as I was saying. And then on the second night, the master said, the Shurangama Sutra says that when a person returns to truth with a capital T, in the attaining of the way, everything in all the 10 directions, including empty space itself, vanishes without a trace. And this is part of what happens as we are as we are entering deeply into the space, the wordless space, the attachment-less space, prerequisite to Zen Kensho. It is called samadhi. When we are so fully focused, there is nothing but the infinite search, the total presence. And it's a vital prerequisite. We can't really have much of a kensho if we try to stick one leg out of the practice. It's impossible, actually. And as a certain point in our practice, this entering into samadhi, into deep samadhi, where everything disappears, can be frightening as we're stepping near the threshold of that doorway into samadhi. Fear can come up, anxiety can come up. We can back out for seemingly reasonable reasons, but it's important to persist there. We're drawn to Zen practice because we have some sense that there is something, as one person put it, just beyond the veil, something important to return to connection with. And there is. It is our true self, which is not outside of us, but it seems so. And part of us is deeply invested in the status quo. We have become conditioned in our life from infancy onward to fitting in with the crowd. Sometimes fitting in with the crowd means doing extreme things to get attention. But for most people, it means behaving in a way that is culturally acceptable. And it becomes very important to us to do that. We're taught in many different ways as we grow up the importance of doing that. And so there's a part of us that is deeply invested, for good reason, in what is termed a self-image, because it's not who we really are. It's sort of a mask that we put on our face, or armor that we protect ourselves with. And we have an investment in that. At the same time, we're drawn to becoming free, to connecting with that sense of freedom, of something beyond that is indescribable but invaluable. And so for a while, there's a battle between the two sides. And that's what brings up anxiety or fear or backing away when we get close to that entry into samadhi. Because samadhi means letting go. A deep samadhi is letting go, going beyond, dropping out of that suit of armor, letting go the mask so that you can experience who you really are. And there's a great deal of fear that can come up there, but know that as you go through that, and it takes time for the whole thing to unfold in a way that you dare to step across that threshold. But as you do, courage comes up as well. And as you continue to deepen and let go, you begin to see more freedom in your own life and courage to be who you really are. For a long time in my life, I would say things in response to what people asked or in conversations. And as soon as they were out of my mouth, those words, I would think to myself, what? That's not how I feel. That's not what I would say. But I did it because I needed that protective coloration. Now it is different. Now I'm able to tune in and understand what is appropriate to say, not necessarily what is culturally acceptable, but what is appropriate to say or do. And the courage to say it and do it is there as well to underlie it. It took a long time to get to that point. I remember when I was in my first year of college, and I was in an advanced English class, and one of the things we had to do, there was an exam in which we were to read 2 different articles and then do a comparison of them, critical analysis. And as I began to read, it was a very challenging situation for me, not because of the English, but because I came down with a migraine at the middle of it, or at the beginning of it, and I actually could hardly see to be able to read. Plus, if you've ever had migraines, you know that they fuzz your head pretty badly. And but what I remember most about that experience was that the articles happened to be about other-directed versus inner-directed human beings. And I realized with sinking heart that I was what was called other-directed. In other words, what other people felt I should do, or what I thought they felt I should do, I did, whether it was authentic to myself or not. And it was a long time before I was able to move into authenticity, but it was so worth it. It was so worth it. This is what our Zen practice brings forth for us if we allow it to, and if we stick it out. Initially going into the Zen practice, we are highly committed to maintaining the status quo, to hanging on to this self-image. But as we continue on, gradually we become free. This is why it's difficult to practice in the beginning, because of that investment in the status quo, because of our conditioning to not pay attention for more than fractions of seconds. But as we continue, we will find ourselves being able to be present more fully and for longer periods of time as well as a result of the practice. And it has untold benefits far beyond potentially coming to awakening. It has benefits for our health, for our welfare, for our sanity, for the quality of our life. This is what you can do on the cushion if you persist. I thank you for listening now, and we will stop here and recite the 4 vows. Someone made a comment on one of the Teishos on YouTube and said, you stop before the 4 vows. And yes, we do stop before the 4 vows. We do recite them after the recording is stopped.